What's going on, Space Monkeys? Welcome to Political Fight Club. I'm Robert Durden. We're going to continue with our book club, Dreamland by Sam Quinones today. This is chapter 52, I believe. It's called No Scarface, No Kingpins, and I highly recommend you just go out and buy this book, especially if you want to actually read it for yourself over the period of days instead of listening to me stumble my way through it, stutter my way through it for 6 months or so. It's an excellent book. So this is page 283, No Scarface, No Kingpins. Denver, Colorado. That was a daunting thought. I kept it in mind as, not long after that, I stood in an apartment 1,200 miles away in northeast Denver watching a thin kid with short-cropped hair tell detectives a story. Jose Carlos was a classic Jalisco boy. He was 21 and a faint mustache was trying to sprout above his lip. Shackled to a chair, he was shirtless and nervously watched Dennis Chavez and a team of narcotics officers go through every bit of his apartment. The day before, a narcotics officer named Jez Sandoval had spotted a woman making heroin deliveries at a southeast Denver parking lot. When officers pulled her over, she gave up the apartment and Jose Carlos. So the narcs busted in. Jose Carlos said he'd been in town for only 3 months selling heroin. He owned to being from the town of Acaponeta in Nayarit. The cops asked who his boss was. He started tearing up and shutting down at that point. He'd been in Columbus, Ohio and Charlotte, North Carolina. Working construction, he said. None of the cops in the room were buying that, but as long as he wasn't giving anybody up above him, they didn't care what his story was. The case, like hundreds before, would go no higher than this scruffy kid. His one-bedroom apartment contained nothing that they could use against him. In fact, it contained almost nothing at all. A Walmart card table, 4 folding chairs, a small flat-screen TV, votive candles to the Virgin of Guadalupe, a pile of clothes, some DVD action flicks, and packets of Pizza Hut hot sauce. No bed, no sofa. No weapons, no cash either. On the table were balloons and a plate with only a couple of grams of tar heroin. Jose Carlos, it appeared, supplied the Denver drivers with their balloons. There was a slight twist to this operation. This Jalisco cell had its addicts call a Denver number. Those calls were forwarded down to a phone in Nayarit, where an operator answered, then relayed the addict's order to a driver up in Denver, a heroin call center. This bust was small time by traditional narcotics standards, yet, short of arresting the cell owner down in Mexico, the narcotics team from Denver's District 3 was doing what probably harmed the Jalisco heroin business model the most, raising its cost of business. The Jalisco system succeeded because it reacted to how American cops traditionally worked drugs. Narcotics teams found barren apartments and peons like Jose Carlos. The money and most of the drugs were back in Mexico. This deflated the cops and prosecutors. Thus, more so than any traditional drug network in the country, the Jalisco boys were forcing law enforcement to rethink old strategies, particularly as the opiate epidemic took hold. The upper and middle class junkies scrounging for dope hung around District 3's trendy University of Denver and Washington Park neighborhoods. I've been to Washington Park. I used to live in Denver. Didn't know that there's a lot of heroin addicts around there. The Jalisco drivers were there too. District 3 cops didn't have the manpower or budget to work long undercover cases. Their approach to the Jalisco boys was simpler, born of necessity, and revolved around Officer Jez Sandoval. After 22 years as a cop and 16 working drugs, Sandoval had become curiously like the Jalisco runners he tracked. He was as inconspicuous as they were and about as relentless. In many years as a crime reporter, I never have encountered a narcotics officer as low-tech as Sandoval. He uses only a department-issue flip cell phone and a 2007 Honda SUV. He works business hours because the department pays no overtime. He works alone. In his cubicle is a photo of the Lone Ranger, a gift from colleagues. He almost never uses informants, never buys drugs undercover, never works wiretaps. Instead, Sandoval trolls South Denver strip mall parking lots searching for telltale signs of deals about to happen. Frantic white kids in cars, backed into parking spaces, their heads swiveling, surveying all that moves. He watches until the Jalisco runner passes, then follows both cars, calling for backup to arrest them down some side street when the deal goes down. I find myself some days traveling all over the district looking, he said. Doing that, Sandoval made huge numbers of cases. His method is low cost and high volume, the law enforcement version of the Jalisco heroin system. True, he was arresting the drug world's equivalent of day laborers. They had only small amounts of heroin, they kept quiet, were deported, and were replaced in a couple of days. But Sandoval's approach recognized that Jalisco cell owners were small businessmen. They were sensitive to cost like every other small businessman. They weren't Scarface-style kingpins spending wantonly and living for today. Some cell leaders required their drivers to turn in receipts at the end of the day. They had to account for every dollar. So the way Sandoval saw it, each bus forced a crew chief in Nayarit to buy another car in Denver, find another apartment, and send another driver across the border. Each was a headache for a businessman who had already had to make sure that his runners, 18 to 25-year-old males, most of them, didn't run out of supply, didn't party, and didn't get anyone pregnant, didn't use the product they were selling. With each cell phone Sandoval confiscated, the crew chief had to reconstitute his client list, though soon to cells began keeping master lists of clients' phone numbers on a computer somewhere in Nayarit, Sandoval figured. The more drivers we take off, the more desperate they get for drivers, he said as we circled the southeast Denver strip mall. Amid an epidemic, this was about as good as the cops in District 3 could do. New addicts graduated from OxyContin to heroin every day, and dope demand rage across Denver. Drawing from deep labor pools in Mexico, the Jalisco Boy system appeared impervious. Sandoval's busts were as cost-effective as any other strategy. Denver's District 3 narcs took heart, therefore, from small victories. A couple of weeks before I showed up, one Jalisco cell owner, angered that several drivers had been arrested, sent up a guy to act as a consultant of a sort. The consultant's job was to accompany the drivers on their routes, study how they worked, and suggest ways that they might avoid arrest. Officers arrested him too. All right, we'll get to the next chapter in the next episode. It's called A Parent's Soul Pain on page 286. Keep fighting that good fight out there, guys. I'll talk to you later.